Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class this morning. And welcome to what will be our final live stream of the semester. And as we get started this morning, I just want to thank you all for a really good semester. I think every semester we have these Web 115 classes, or every spring semester we have these Web 115 classes. And I get to see a lot of good creativity, a lot of learning, a lot of growth, and it's always good to see that. And I hope these live streams have been valuable in helping you out on your journey this semester. So before we jump into our content here, just a couple of quick announcements. Like I said, this is our final live stream of the semester. And as such, we got to kind of think about, well, what we're going to do for the remainder of the semester. You have your Module 11 lab, which is due on Sunday, and it's kind of a summative project, if you will. It kind of takes a look back at several of the other modules that we've done previously, asks you to combine them together into a singular website. And so, we've kind of been building on different things along the way, so this shouldn't be too bad for you. And then next week, really from essentially the 3rd, May the 3rd through May 11th at noon, that's the time that you have for your final exam. So what I'd like to probably do is schedule some kind of question and answer period or some kind of drop-in session for that week, since there won't be any live streams for any of my classes that week. I'll probably schedule some kind of extended office hours drop-in through Microsoft Teams a couple days next week. So be looking for information about that toward the end of the week. I'll probably put it out in your weekend reminders as to when I'm going to be doing or having those extended office hours drop-in times, in case you want to come in and ask questions about the final or anything of that nature. With that being said, that kind of takes us to the end. So we just want to make sure that we finish strong, keep our head up, just plow right toward that finish line. And today's live stream about writing your best code is going to be relatively short, because this module is kind of intentionally really short in general. Like, the bulk of the module is kind of the project, the lab for this module. And it's looking at application of what we've done all semester. And really, when you look at the last module and you look at this module, maybe a little less so in our accessibility module, but definitely in this module, this is all just stuff that we've been learning and doing and talking about throughout the semester. We're just talking about it in a little different context, so that you're actually writing the code that you've learned correctly. And so that's what we're going to kind of be looking at today. It's looking at writing your best code, and we're just going to kind of cherry pick some of the stuff out of your reading material for today. That reading material gives you a lot of really good information about how to write compliant code and how to write good code. So I want to make sure that you go through that, read that, pay special attention to that. But I'm going to pull a handful of things out of that to talk about in our live stream today, so we can just make sure that we're covering it and that everybody knows what the deal is, right? So again, when we're talking about writing our best code, we're talking about writing our code in such a way that it is compliant and solid and strong and renders correctly in every browser. And so if we're writing compliant code that follows all of our rules, then our websites should render the same in every modern browser. And that's something that we'll talk about as we kind of progress through our live stream today. So one of the first things that we want to do is we want to make sure that we're writing standards compliant markup. Now, one of the things that you've probably noticed this semester is that HTML is forgiving, right? Like you can make some mistakes, you can leave out some tags, you can forget a thing here or there, and it's still going to render on your browser, right? It's still going to make something that looks like a website. And that's all well and good, but just because your code rendered successfully, that doesn't mean that your code is good. This is the point where you'll start to see like variance between different browsers. This is the point where sometimes things just might not work. And it's one of the things that we want to pay attention to as we're getting started with writing our best code, is that we want to pay close attention when we're writing our HTML to be sure and we nest and close all elements correctly, and to use IDs and classes appropriately, and always validating our code as we are examining it. You know, just go back through it and check it. Make sure everything is in its proper place. You know, follow our ID and class rules. You know, when we say use an ID, you only use an ID for one specific element. You can use a class for as many elements as you want, but IDs are element specific. And the big thing here is that we want to make sure that we have everything nested and closed properly. And that's our first example that we want to look at, is improper nesting and improper closure. Because you might see something like this. Right? And so we see several big bad issues here in this code. And the first thing that you might notice right off the bat is that we have two ID statements here that are exactly the same. ID intro, ID intro. Now that's going to tell you right there that that's a big no-no. These either need to be classes, so it needs to be class intro, or we need to make these completely separate, completely different names. Or we need to put them in some kind of container, since we have two paragraphs that would have the same sort of styling and the same sort of ID selector to it. So in this case, what we might do is we might put a section tag on this, give it the ID of intro, and then close our section. So that's another option as to how we can approach this. Like I have some good code on the next slide that I'll look at that approaches this a little bit differently. It approaches these as classes instead of this, but this would also be valid. Taking our semantic section tag, giving it the ID of intro, and putting our paragraphs in it. And so now after we've focused in on this and we've seen, well, okay, we need to fix those IDs. That's one thing. Well, it's kind of like one of those pictures where when you pull out further, you can see more wrong with the picture. You might have seen some of those online. Right, and what we have here is we have improperly nested. In our first paragraph, we have improperly nested tags. We see that our paragraph starts here with the initial P tag, and it ends here. But outside of our paragraph, we have a period. So we have a period that would be part of a sentence semantically that is outside of our semantic paragraph here, which is going to cause issues. Because that means that this paragraph isn't a part of, and this period are two separate entities. So if we tried to style this paragraph, this period does not belong to it, so it would not get styled accordingly. And we also see this weird use of the strong tag here, where we have are strong ending outside of our paragraph. When we use something like strong or mark or one of those types of tags, that is for text that is inside of a paragraph. That is to show importance for a text inside of a paragraph. You learn more about that semantic difference in the last module about accessibility. So having this strong extend outside of the paragraph means that it has some text from within the paragraph, some text from outside of the paragraph, and that's going to cause some issues down the road. And then here we see in our second paragraph, it's not even closed at all. We have our opening paragraph tag here, but we don't have a closing paragraph tag. Now, one of the interesting things is that if we put this on a website, it'll render. It'll render fine, and it'll look like it works. There are all these little issues that will come out by writing this incorrect code. Not being able to style things together, not being, having that paragraph run into everything that comes after it, so maybe you're not able to place things correctly. Different styling issues, different browser issues. And that's uncompliant code. Now, if we wanted to take this code and make it compliant, we kind of looked at one way we could do part of it here. But if we wanted to take this code and make it compliant, we'd look at something more like this. So now we can see the differences here. Instead of IDs, we've used classes. Our paragraph fully contains all of the text that belongs to that paragraph. Our strong is fully contained inside of our paragraph. And we have this paragraph tag at the end. So that's something that we want to see as we're kind of going forward with this. And this just looks better, right? Like, typically you can tell like good clean code by the way that it looks. Like, it's kind of symmetrical. It looks, it just makes sense and kind of looks nice. Like, if we even just look at this code here, it just kind of looks sloppy. Like you get a vibe off of it, and it's not really, it's kind of tough to say. Like, you just kind of get a vibe off of it. Like, it just kind of looks out of balance. But like, even when you look at this good sort of code, it just looks better. It's more organized. It's easier to read. It makes sense to have this sort of structure. So in that sort of way, when we're looking at this sort of writing our best code, it's not just going to help us with compliance and making sure that all modern browsers render our sites in the same sort of way, but it's just going to look better. And that's going to help other people who are working on projects with us to make more sense of what we write. Speaking of make more sense, we want to kind of make sure that we're using semantic elements. Because it's these semantic elements that allow our browsers, and as you learned last week, assistive technologies to make more sense of the website. Now, the library of elements in HTML is huge, right? And that's why we didn't focus on every individual element as we kind of went through. We cherry picked some big important ones, and we talked about some of the sub ones underneath, and all the rest of the stuff is kind of up to your own research. Right? Like, when we look at the library of elements in HTML, it's enormous. There are over 100 elements, right? And if we sat and talked about each one in depth to the way that it needed to be covered, it would take us 3 semesters minimum probably to be able to cover more. I mean, like, we have an advanced markup and scripting class in the fall that many of you will be taking that'll look at even more stuff. So to get things in the depth that you need to try to understand this HTML markup, well, it takes time. So what we're encouraged to do is we're encouraged to research and double check our code to ensure we're using the proper semantic elements. Sections and articles and mains and headers and all this sort of stuff, right? Things that we've sort of briefly talked about and you've read about throughout the semester. Your reading for this module kind of calls the overuse of divs, divitis, right? Like a div or division tag is a non-semantic tag. It doesn't really have any meaning to it, but it's kind of an easy container tag, and a lot of times we get kind of caught up on using them. But it's much better and more appropriate to use these semantic tags because they provide more meaning. So if we look at something like this, right? Here's some bad code. And you could probably see some issues springing up here. First thing is that we have an issue with our strong tag again, right? Where it's outside of its containing tag. So that's an issue right there. And we have one total section here that doesn't have any sort of tags wrapped around it. We have these BR tags. You might not have seen those. You should have read about them early on in the semester, but you might not remember. Those are break tags. They provide a blank line in our markup. So they don't really have any meaning. They just give us a little line, a little line break. And then our span class, or our span tag here, is just a span of text. So it's just outlining a specific little piece of text. So it doesn't really have any semantic meaning either. So nothing here really has any semantic meaning aside from our strong tags, which are used improperly. We even have an entire paragraph here that is outside of any sort of tags. And so we can kind of put this in perspective with the stuff that we looked at last week. Since none of these elements have really semantic meaning to them, what's that going to mean to somebody using assistive technology? That's going to be some big confusion. Maybe this welcome back, this first line here, maybe it should be an H1 heading. Maybe this should be a paragraph. Maybe this second, it's been a while. What have you been up to lately? Maybe that should be a paragraph. Right? So we can kind of communicate that not only to our users' assistive technology, but also to our browsers as they choose how to render the content that's on the page. And so in our fixed example of this, in our good code, that's exactly what we've done. And again, notice how clean this looks. Notice how clean this looks versus how sloppy this looks. Again, we sort of get that vibe off of good code that it looks a lot cleaner and it's a lot easier to read. And like the stuff that we have here with the strong tag, we don't even need that at all when we're using our H1 semantic tag, because that's going to provide us that initial styling. That's going to provide the importance that the strong tag would give it semantically, and it's going to apply that specific styling, that bold, that bigger text that you would get visually from utilizing the strong tag. So that's a win-win situation, right? Like, it's giving us everything. It's giving us everything in a semantic nature, and it's making our code a whole lot easier to read. And we can see that here. So the next thing I'd like to talk about really quickly is about good document structure. And by and large, like, this will become more important in your next level class. Because in this class, I like to take a kind of a two hands while you're learning approach and just simplify the markup writing process just as much as possible. So I have you write your code in CodePen. And so in the next level class, we'll focus more on the document structure. Although you started your semester writing the document structure as you learned how to write the HTML skeleton, our doc type, our HTML tags, our head tags, our body tags. Right? And really, in your CodePens, all of that's implied. It's all sort of in the background that was coded by the CodePen itself. But when you're writing your own page, it's crucial that you always include that HTML skeleton that we've discussed in every single site. We're going to use our proper document structure, our HTML tags, our head tags, our body tags, and our doc type our doc type. And this, the doc type on its own is going to help us have a website that renders the same across different browsers, because there's no ambiguity in the doc type. We're going to keep our pages standards compliant, fully semantic, and that way they're going to look how we want them to look, which is really great. No examples for this one, because those examples come out of Module 1. Right? Write your HTML skeleton. And make sure you're following those structure guidelines. The next thing that we have here is using practical ID and class values, which is something that I believe we've mentioned before. Is that when we have a name for an ID or a name for a class selector, we want these to be contextual and we want them to provide meaning. And that way we can understand, right, just by looking at the code, what we intend to do with this particular styling for this particular ID or class. We want them to be practical. We want them to be related to the content itself and not just the style of the content. We see a bad example here. Right? So we have some error text. Maybe we want that error text to be red. So we make it red and we make the class called red. This is fine. This will work. But what's happened here is there's too much ambiguity. What does red mean? Is it a red background? Is it red text? What is it? To handle this better, we want to make sure that we have our class name contextually specific with that content. So what would we put in for a class for some text that says error, please try again? Well, that sounds like some kind of alert. Maybe we would want that to be alert. And we could have this styling for alerts that we could put on all of our alerts that we need to utilize going forward. And so alert is a lot more descriptive. Makes a lot of sense. Because we can look at that and we can understand it and we know what we're doing with that. Finally, for the purposes of this presentation, I want to look at how we modularize styles for reuse, which is pretty important, right? We have this in programming in general. We have this acronym that we like to use, which is DRY, dry. And this acronym, DRY, stands for Don't Repeat Yourself. Because of the way CSS is built, it allows for styles to be reused. Like that's what classes are for. So I don't have to build a completely different style for every single element in my document. I don't have to do it. I can build some modular styles using classes that we can use over and over and over again so that we don't have to write the same code over and over and over again. Right, so if we look at this example of bad code here, we have a class called news and a class called events. They're exactly the same. They're styled exactly the same. Now, one thing that we might want to do is we might want to do some sort of segmented modularity here. Like if we wanted one to be slightly different than the other, then we might approach it this way. And we might use our comma separator. to separate them. But in this case, since we're just using the exact same code twice over, well, we can just take these and combine them into one set of CSS rules. And we can use that one new class on the different elements, the news, the events, what have you. Now we can still give our different sections the IDs of news and events and all that sort of stuff. And that's going to help us separate those sections semantically. But in this sort of instance here where we're styling classes and they're exactly the same, we can combine them into one class that would look more like this. We give it a new name because we want that new name to be something that's contextual, so we name it something like feature box or feet box, as we've done here. And we take those styles, put them into one element, and then we just apply that class to our different elements in our HTML, whether they're the events element or they're the news element or whatever. Anything that would have that same base styling can have this class. And that's going to save us a lot of repeated effort. It's going to make life a whole lot easier for us. And that's pretty great. And so that's where I'm going to stop for the live stream. I told you I would have this be a bit of a shorter live stream. The long live streams we've been doing, they've been about an hour. The short ones I like them to be about 30 minutes. And, all we've really done here is we've just highlighted a couple of the things from your textbook or from your reading. It's not really a textbook. It's more of a reading. We just highlighted a few things from your reading to have them make more sense to you, hopefully. I'm going to hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes in case anybody watching live has any questions. I want to once again thank you for getting involved and watching the live streams this semester. I hope you've found some value in them. I hope you've learned a thing or two along the way from the live streams. I feel like if you've learned just one thing from the live streams this semester, then they've done their job. Which, sometimes that can be questionable, but I think, I think they're pretty valuable. Since this is my last opportunity to verbalize it, I'll go ahead and tell you that I've enjoyed working with you all this semester. Thank you for watching the live streams. If you have any questions, please let me know. And we'll see you next time, whenever that may be.